let's move on a bit to talk about how identity politics is impacting Britain. I mean, we've just finished the Commonwealth Conference in Samoa, and Keir Starmer came away essentially having to agree that there will be a conversation about reparations for slavery to the former British colonies. Now, obviously, he at first said there's no way this is going to happen. This can't happen. But he seems to not have found any argument against it. He seems to the only argument seems to be we don't have the money. Britain's too poor for it.
Well, I looked up the figures, and there was a report authored in 2023 by a judge at the UN that claimed that if Britain were to repay its debts in reparations, it would pay 18 trillion pounds. The gross net asset value of the United Kingdom is about 11 trillion pounds. So we'd have to sell everything we own as a nation in order to meet the bill. It does show you, though, that this is really a performative discussion. And I don't think the Labour Party has any serious intention. I may be proved wrong, but I don't think there is a serious intention to actually pay anything. But it is a performative way of political elites talking about the history of racism and slavery instead of doing things about the structural problems that particular countries face today.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real problem. We're talking about countries that have real economic and political problems. And instead of reckoning with those, we're talking about a completely academic, hypothetical repayment that could never be made and would be completely unjust. Just on the historical point, I mean, it's obviously also worth making the observation that if every country in the world had to repay for their history of slavery, then almost every country in the world would be making huge payments to some portion of either their own population or a foreign one, including many African countries that enslaved Jewish people. And so it's a complete farce, a complete academic game that really equivocates from the real issues that certain countries face.
Tom?
No, absolutely. And I think what's also quite dispiriting about this whole discussion is the way in which it fixes these other Commonwealth countries as kind of forever the supplicant as well. So forever kind of in need of this sort of reparations, in need of this kind of reset purely because of the fact that they almost like can't make it on their own. And that I think is an unpleasant kind of dynamic to this in particular. I think Luke's exactly right about, how far in history do you want to go back? you know, and also when you think about the modern diverse nation that Britain is, if we were in a situation where, say, British taxpayers had to fund some sort of reparations fund for various different Commonwealth countries, you would have a situation in which various people who are themselves the descendants of slaves having to pay reparations to nations where their own parents and grandparents might have actually migrated from. So it's this very bizarre, it doesn't really make sense. There's not a direct line you can draw between these two things. And also, I think, relies upon a slightly strange idea of how particular nations have developed as well. The idea that the only reason that the UK is still just about a first world country is because of slavery and colonialism, as if the Industrial Revolution meant nothing, as if the fortunes of a nation can't take different turns is absurd. In the same way as if the only reason that certain nations haven't developed as quickly as others is purely down to whether or not they were colonized or not. There are plenty of examples, if you look around the world, of former colonies that have done pretty well and former colonies which continue to not have been able to develop in the same way. And that's not purely down to those nations or the people within them, natural resources, all kinds of different things play into that. But it's this really simplistic kind of binary that is set up. And I think it's because of the fact that it's not really about any real, let's properly make account for past wrongs and try to make up for it. It's just about feeding a narrative which has become increasingly popular within sort of Western intelligentsia themselves, which is that we are born in sin and we should try to make amends for it in some way, shape or form. And then you just see various leaders who quite understandably are thinking, even if we won't get the 18 trillion out of them, we might get a few 100 million. You can understand why they feel empowered to give it a try at this point in time.
Well, exactly. It's never really spelled out. I mean, obviously, 18 trillion isn't going to happen, but often it's not spelled out what people mean, and people seem to mean different things all the time when they ask for reparations. So I remember there was I think it was the University of Glasgow paid reparations for its links to the slave trade. I mean, it ended up just funding some educational programs in the Caribbean. Sometimes it just means it funds some sinecure for, some sort of woke activity somewhere in a developing country, sometimes it might mean paying people directly, but you never really get to the rub of it. You always suspect that it's just to fund some some naff NGO or whatever, rather than actually helping people on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, you'd hope that the help that these institutions can give to projects or funds overseas could be done on their own terms, rather than saying that this is because you were historically a victim of slavery. I'm sure that kind of funding goes on all the time.
One thing that's interesting, though, that came out of the conference was you had Keir Starmer try to bat away the whole discussion by saying we should look to the future, we should partner on projects around climate change and so on. And then the sort of 1-2 punch was then, we also want reparations about climate change because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the fact that developed nations spew so much more carbon than these little island states who are, suffering the consequences of it and so on. So it's quite clear that he can't win on this particular subject. And actually, talking about what form reparations could take, if it did get to that, you would worry that it would be we're going to build you some very unreliable renewable energy rather than actually help you properly develop, which could well be the way this thing goes if these two discussions get fused, as they seem to maybe be.
Yeah, I mean, and the climate thing is fascinating. I mean, we are playing a role as a global power in hindering the development of these countries precisely through climate change. We tell them that they can't, lots of countries in Africa are abundant in oil and gas, for instance, and we're among the powerful countries telling them, no, don't go there because of climate change. So, there is a way to resolve that issue, to industrialize much of Africa, much of the Caribbean, things like that. But we don't seem to want to go there. It's not very fashionable. It's much more fashionable, seemingly, to just pay out from the British taxpayer than actually develop these countries, to actually create wealth that might actually take people somewhere to a better future.